The Supreme Court chamber was silent, its marble columns and high ceilings echoing with the weight of history. The empty benches and the imposing bench where the justices would soon sit seemed to hold their own breath, anticipating a moment that would be remembered for generations. Across the country, the American flag flew at half-mast, a symbol of the gravity of the day. In city squares and small towns alike, crowds gathered around glowing screens, their faces tense with anticipation. News anchors spoke in hushed, urgent tones, aware that the verdict would ripple through every corner of American life. On September 7, 2025, the eyes of the nation turned to the Supreme Court. The 9 justices faced a question that cut to the very core of presidential authority. Was it legal for former President Trump to impose sweeping tariffs on foreign goods, bypassing Congress by invoking emergency powers? The stakes could not have been higher. As the Chief Justice prepared to read the majority opinion, a hush fell over the country. On Wall Street, traders paused mid-transaction, their eyes glued to the news. In factories and workshops, workers gathered around break-room televisions while families at home watched live coverage, united in suspense. The nation, from bustling cities to rural heartlands, collectively held its breath. The ruling, when it came, was decisive and clear. The Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, ending months of speculation and legal wrangling. The sound of the gavel echoed not just in the courtroom but across the country, signaling a turning point in American governance. The majority opinion, read aloud by the Chief Justice, declared that the president had overstepped constitutional boundaries by using emergency powers to impose massive taxes without the explicit approval of Congress. The executive branch had violated the separation of powers enshrined in the Constitution. The decision reinforced a fundamental principle: the power to regulate commerce and levy taxes belongs to Congress, not the president. Legal scholars and lawmakers alike recognized the ruling as a reaffirmation of the checks and balances that define American democracy. For business owners and consumers, the decision marked both an end and a beginning. The era of sweeping tariffs was over, but uncertainty loomed. Would prices fall? Would jobs return or disappear? Across the nation, people wondered what the future would hold. In Washington, the atmosphere was electric. Lawmakers, lobbyists, and journalists scrambled to interpret the ruling's implications. The corridors of power buzzed with urgent conversations, as everyone tried to understand how this landmark decision would reshape the political and economic landscape. Financial analysts debated how markets would react, while legal experts pored over every word of the court's opinion. Would international trade recover? Would Congress reclaim its authority? Or would new battles erupt over executive power? The questions were as complex as the ruling itself. The decision sent shockwaves through the political world. For supporters of Trump's America First agenda, it was a stunning rebuke. For his critics, it was a long-awaited victory for constitutional order. Across the country, reactions ranged from outrage to relief, as Americans grappled with the new reality. The Supreme Court's ruling was more than a legal decision, it was a powerful check on executive ambition. By upholding the separation of powers, the court reminded the nation that no one, not even the president, is above the law. For Trump and his legal team, the verdict was a devastating blow after years of legal battles and public debate. Supporters outside the courthouse looked on in disbelief, their hopes dashed by the finality of the court's words. Throughout his presidency, Trump had argued that the tariffs were essential for national security and economic fairness. He insisted that bold action was needed to protect American jobs and industries from foreign competition. But the Supreme Court sided with small businesses and state governments, declaring the tariffs unconstitutional. For many entrepreneurs and local leaders, the decision was a cause for celebration, a chance to rebuild and move forward. With the court's doors closing on the case, the decision was final. There would be no further appeals, no more legal maneuvers. The chapter was closed and the nation would have to adapt to a new reality. The stage was set for a massive unwinding of years of protectionist trade policy. Cargo ships were unloaded, tariffs removed, and factories across America began to adjust. The nation, having held its breath, now faced the challenge and the promise of a new era in trade and governance. The legal saga that would eventually reach the nation's highest court began years earlier, rooted in President Trump's bold and controversial use of executive power. From the very start of his administration, Trump made it clear that he intended to leave a lasting mark on American policy, not just through legislation but by wielding the full force of presidential authority. One of his most ambitious goals was to reshape U.S. trade policy, which he argued had long disadvantaged American workers and industries. Trump's team believed that decades of globalization and free trade agreements had eroded the nation's manufacturing base and left the U.S. vulnerable to foreign competition. In response, his administration imposed sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imported goods, targeting countries like China and even close allies. The official justification was to combat what Trump called unfair trade practices and to protect critical American industries such as steel and aluminum from being undercut by cheaper foreign imports. But rather than seeking new laws from Congress, Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, a decades-old law originally designed to address national security threats. This allowed him to act quickly and unilaterally, bypassing the usual checks and balances. This unprecedented move sparked immediate and fierce opposition. Critics argued that Trump was abusing emergency powers for economic policy, and lawsuits were filed in federal courts across the country. What followed was a protracted and highly publicized legal battle, with both sides digging in for a fight that would last years. Trump's legal team maintained that the president needed the flexibility IEPA provided to respond to rapidly changing threats to national economic security. They insisted that waiting for Congress would leave the country exposed to foreign manipulation and economic harm. They warned that if the court struck down the tariffs, it would severely limit the executive branch's ability to negotiate tough deals on the world stage. The administration argued that the president must have the authority to act decisively in defense of American interests. At its core, the fight was about much more than economics or trade policy. It was a fundamental clash over the balance of power between the president and Congress, a debate as old as the Constitution itself. Could the president declare an economic emergency and act alone, or did such sweeping actions require legislative approval? The Trump administration pointed to a long history of presidents using IEPA and similar laws to address international crises, arguing that Trump's actions were consistent with past precedent. They claimed that limiting the president now would undermine the office for generations to come. By appealing to the Supreme Court, both sides sought a definitive answer, a landmark ruling that could either expand or restrict presidential authority in matters of trade and national security. The stakes were nothing less than the future of executive power in America. If the court upheld Trump's use of IEPA, it would set a powerful precedent, allowing future presidents to impose sweeping import taxes simply by declaring a national emergency. The decision would reverberate through the halls of government for decades. On the other hand, if the court struck down the tariffs, it would deal a major blow to Trump's legacy and could force the government to refund billions of dollars collected from American businesses. The financial and political fallout would be immense. The stakes were enormous, with consequences that reached far beyond the tariffs themselves. The outcome would shape the limits of presidential power, the future of American trade, and the daily lives of millions of workers, businesses, and families across the country. Before the case could ever reach the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court, it first had to make its way through the lower federal courts, a journey that would prove pivotal in shaping the legal and political landscape surrounding the president's actions. These courts, often overlooked by the public, play a crucial role in interpreting the law and setting boundaries for executive power. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the lower courts were not willing to simply rubber stamp the administration's sweeping use of authority. In these courtrooms, a clear and resounding message began to emerge. The president's actions would not go unchecked. Judges scrutinized the administration's arguments, weighing the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress. The U.S. Court of International Trade, which specializes in cases involving trade and tariffs, became the first major battleground. Here, businesses and states argued that the president had overstepped his legal authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. After careful consideration, the court sided with the plaintiffs, finding that the president had indeed exceeded the limits of his power. This ruling was a significant victory for the plaintiffs, businesses, states, and trade groups who had been hit hard by the tariffs. The court's decision established a critical precedent. The president could not unilaterally impose massive tariffs without explicit approval from Congress. The mood outside the courthouse was jubilant, as lawyers and their clients celebrated a hard-fought win. Unwilling to accept defeat, the Trump administration quickly appealed the decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, hoping for a reversal that would restore the president's authority. But the appellate court delivered another decisive blow. In a strongly worded opinion, the judges upheld the lower court's ruling, reinforcing the idea that the president's powers under IEPA were not unlimited. This was another setback for the administration, and it sent a powerful signal about the judiciary's willingness to check executive overreach. The majority opinion from the appellate court was clear. The Constitution grants Congress, not the President, the authority to set tariffs and regulate commerce. The court emphasized that these powers are fundamental to the legislative branch and cannot be usurped by the executive, no matter the circumstances. The judges further clarified that IEPA was never intended to serve as a blank check for the president to create sweeping long-term tax regimes. Instead, it was designed for targeted temporary actions in times of genuine emergency, not for broad economic policy shifts. Despite these strong rulings, the appeals court recognized the potential for economic chaos if the tariffs were suddenly lifted. To prevent immediate disruption to American businesses and global supply chains, the court issued a temporary stay, allowing the tariffs to remain in place while the legal process continued. This pause gave the Trump administration a narrow window to appeal to the Supreme Court. The tariffs stayed in effect, but their legal foundation was now shaky, and the business community watched anxiously as the case moved up the judicial ladder. With two courts consistently ruling against the administration, momentum was building. Legal analysts and the media began to speculate about the broader implications for presidential power and the separation of powers in the U.S. government. Both the trial court and the appellate court concluded in no uncertain terms that IEPA did not authorize the president to impose broad, long-term tariffs as a matter of economic policy. Their decisions underscored the importance of checks and balances in the American system. The strong judicial opposition from the lower courts set the stage for a dramatic confrontation at the nation's highest court. The central conflict was now clear. Could the president bypass Congress to reshape trade policy, or would the courts enforce constitutional limits? With the legal and political stakes higher than ever, the stage was set for a final constitutional showdown at the Supreme Court, a decision that would have lasting consequences for the balance of power in Washington. As the nation watched and waited, all eyes turned to the justices, who now held the fate of the tariffs and the limits of presidential power in their hands. At its core, this legal battle asked, does the president have the authority to set broad tariffs without Congress? The Constitution gives Congress the power to levy taxes and regulate commerce with foreign nations. Opponents argued Trump's actions directly infringed on this mandate. The administration pointed to IEPA, claiming it gave the president authority to act in emergencies. They argued persistent trade imbalances justified using tariffs as a tool of economic defense. The major questions doctrine became central. On issues of vast economic significance, the president needs clear congressional authorization. Courts have used this doctrine to rein in executive power. Challengers insisted a vague emergency statute wasn't enough for such a sweeping policy shift. The Supreme Court had to decide where to draw the line between executive flexibility and legislative authority. A ruling for Trump would have expanded presidential power. A ruling against him reaffirmed Congress's control over trade. The case forced the justices to interpret not just a statute, but the very architecture of American democracy.